Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, inshallah, we are going to complete our talk about the concepts related to the macroeconomics. As you know, that in the last class, we discussed some concepts related to the macroeconomics, and we discussed the Keynesian theory and the classical view about the unemployment and how could the unemployment rate decline without any intervention by the government according to the classical view. Today we presented a historical information about the Great Depression period, if you remember. Today we are going to complete our talk about the Keynesian theory or the Keynesian revolution after the Great Depression period. As we mentioned that during the Great Depression period, there were high unemployment rate, the gross domestic product declined, the prices declined because, as you know, that there was a recession, right? And the reduction in the wages and the prices did not solve the high unemployment rate, right? According to the classical view, they assumed that the unemployment rate would decline without any intervention by the government, and as a result, due to the reduction or the direct reduction in the wages without any intervention by the government, right? During the Great Depression, which consists or continued for more than 6 years, the unemployment rate continued to increase and the wages declined, but the unemployment problem or phenomena did not solve. So, during this period, Mr. John Maynard Keynes, tried to find a solution for the problem, and he said that to solve or to get rid of unemployment or to solve the unemployment or to decrease the unemployment rate, the government should intervene in the economy by using an expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy, by increasing or stimulating the aggregate demand. So he assumed that the government must stimulate the aggregate demand rather than supply or the aggregate supply. So he assumed that if the government increased its spending, increasing the government spending or expenditure, this leads to what? This would encourage the consumers to buy, or this leads to encourage the aggregate demand for products and services. So this leads to increasing aggregate demand for goods and services. If the aggregate demand increased, this leads to, as you see in this figure, there is a rightward shifting of the aggregate demand curve. This leads to what? Increasing outputs or the aggregate outputs. Because if we have high demand for the products, this would encourage the producers or the factories or the business to produce more and more, right? So the increasing the aggregate demand leads to what? It has two major effects or two main effects. The first one is increasing in the outputs. At the same time, if the aggregate demand increase, this leads to increasing the prices or the overall price levels, right? As you see, if in this diagram or this figure, as you see, this is the aggregate supply curve, and this is the aggregate demand. The equilibrium occurs when there is an intersection between the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is the origin point, E1. At this point, our production or the aggregate output is Y1, and the equilibrium price is P1, right? If the government use an expansionary fiscal policy, means it has increased its spending. This leads to increasing aggregate demand. So there is a rightward shifting of the aggregate demand curve. So we have a new equilibrium point, which is E2. This leads to what? As you see, there is an increasing in Y. Y means the aggregate output from Y1 to Y2. At the same time, the prices would increase because the aggregate demand increase. So there is an increasing in the overall price levels at the same time, right? If the prices increase, the profits of the companies would increase, right? Yes. So, and at the same time, the factories need more workers to produce or to meet the demand for products, right? So, in this case, the factories need more workers or labor to produce the outputs. So we need more workers, so the aggregate demand or the labor demand would what? Increase. So, as you see, and this leads to what? A reduction in the unemployment. So, according to the Keynesian theory, the government, or in order to solve a high unemployment rate or to decrease the unemployment rate, the government should stimulate the aggregate demand, because the stimulation of aggregate demand, or by using an expansion fiscal policy, because the increasing of aggregate demand leads to what? Leads to increasing the aggregate output and increasing the prices, so the profits would increase. And this would encourage the producer or the business to produce more and more, so they need what? More workers to produce. So the labor demand would increase, and then the unemployment rate would decline. Right? Is it clear? Right. Okay. According to the Keynesian view, as you see, when we stimulate the aggregate demand, the unemployment rate declined. Unfortunately, the prices increased. So, a reduction in unemployment by using expansion fiscal policy leads to what? Increasing the inflation rate. So, to solve the high unemployment rate, at the same time the prices increased. And he assumed that the government cannot increase its spending forever. Because, as you see, suppose that this is the urgent equilibrium point. When the government increases its spending on services and goods and investment, something like this, this leads to increasing its spending, which leads to a rightward shifting of the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, right? This leads to what? Increasing aggregate output from Y1 to Y2. Let us suppose that the government use additional expansionary fiscal policy, or expanded more and more. This leads to encouraging or additional increasing in the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 0 to 1 to aggregate demand 2. We have a new equilibrium point, E3, right? Yes.
How the government spending more?
By the government fiscal or the expansion fiscal policy means that the government can buy. The money creation is related to the Federal Reserve System or the central bank, right? But in this case, it can employ more workers. It can buy more goods and services. it can build a new building or new construction, or invest in new construction, and decrease the taxes, or they cut taxes, right? It's called an expansion fiscal policy. Yes.
In some governments, I see in the public sector,
Yes.
they use the disguised employment to reduce the unemployment rate. Is this a solution or a problem?
Yes, it's a solution, because to solve or to get rid of unemployment, the government should use an expansion fiscal policy or expansion monetary policy, right? So it's good. It's a good policy, but it has a negative effect or side effects. Because as you see, when we solve the high unemployment rate, the inflation rate increased. And if we decided to decrease the inflation rate by decreasing the money supply, we are coming to these points in the coming chapters, inshallah. This leads to increasing the unemployment. So what is the solution? The solution is the government, or we advise the government to determine which is the priority for the community. Could we accept high unemployment rate with low inflation rate, or low unemployment rate with high inflation? Which is better for the community? This is the question, right? So let's come back to this analysis, to this figure. As I mentioned, that the government cannot continue increasing its spending forever in order to solve the unemployment, because it will reach, in the long term, according to the Keynesian view or the Keynesian school, the increasing of the government spending leads to increasing aggregate demand to reach the full employment here. This leads to an increasing of the Y from Y1 to Y2 to Y3, and the price will go up to goes up to P3. After this point is called the full employment, means tawadduf kamil. After this point, if all of our or the community resources are at the full employment, if the government, after this point, an increasing in the government spending leads to what? Leads to increasing the aggregate demand without increasing in Y. So we have what? After the full employment, there is only increasing in the overall price level, or inflation only we have, and there is no increasing after this point, because the aggregate supply curve in the long term would be vertical line. So according to the Keynesian view, in the long term or after the full employment, the aggregate supply curve would be vertical line. So any increasing in the government spending leads to what? To increasing in aggregate demand, increasing the prices without increasing the aggregate output. So it's a big problem. The result would be there is no, or we have a full employment and high inflation rate. So in this case, I advise the government to decrease its spending or to use a contractionary fiscal policy. سياسة مالية انكماشية, right? In order to decrease the aggregate demand. Because in this case, the fiscal policy is not effective or ineffective, right? When the aggregate supply is a vertical line, the fiscal policy is ineffective, right? Is it clear? Okay, let's go to another thing, or to the other concepts related to the macroeconomics. So, as you see, in 1936, the John Maynard Keynes published the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Okay, let's go to the fine-tuning term. Fine-tuning term means لو الضبط. نعمل ضبط between the unemployment and inflation. So the fine-tuning term is a phrase, or in 1960, was a phrase used by Walter Heller to refer to the government roles in regulating inflation and unemployment. نوائم ما بين الانفلation والunemployment. Yes. Let's go to another concept, which is stagflation. Stagflation in Arabic means الركود التضخمي. Stagflation, during the stagflation, we have high unemployment rate plus high inflation rate. According to the Keynesian view, if the government wants to decrease unemployment, the inflation would increase, right? Or if the government wants to decrease inflation, the unemployment would increase. During 1970, or 60, the stagflation occurs or occurred. During this period, we have an overall increasing in the overall price level rapidly during the recession. Or we have high unemployment plus high inflation rate, which is against the Keynesian theory. It disagrees with the Keynesian theory, because according to the Keynesian theory, if we have high unemployment rate, we have a low inflation, and vice versa. But the stagflation and the stagflation period occurs when we have high inflation and high unemployment. Stagflation is two parts, or a word with two parts: stagnation plus inflation. Stagflation has two parts, or a word consists of two parts: stagnation and inflation. Stagflation, it's a word with two parts. Stagnation means recession, ركود. The second part is inflation. So stagflation plus inflation, recession plus inflation. So the stagflation is, or when the overall price level rises rapidly, as you see, inflation, during the periods of recession or the high unemployment rates. Right? Okay. Let's go to another concept related to the macroeconomics, which is, I think it's inflation. Okay, the three major factors or concerns of the macroeconomics. What we are going to focus on when we study the macroeconomics. We will focus on inflation, output growth, and unemployment. These are the major concerns of the macroeconomics. شو الأشياء اللي بركز عليها المacroeconomics. Let's come back to the terms related to the macroeconomics. The first, as you see, is inflation. The inflation is what? Is the overall price level, or the increase in the overall price levels in the economy. ارتفاع في المستوى العام للأسعار. We have another term, which is, the hyperinflation. Hyperinflation means تضخم الجامح. The rapid increasing in the overall price level, or when the overall price level increased rapidly or quickly. So suppose that the prices or the overall price levels today as 10 shekels, tomorrow it would be 20 shekels, and then 50 shekels, and so on. So in this case, the overall price level increased rapidly or quickly. It's called the hyperinflation, and this case is rare. Rare means نادرة الحدوث, right? We have another term which is deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. It's the decreasing in the overall price level. It's a decrease in the overall price level. When we study inflation, we focus on, or we have to ask many questions. Like, what are the main causes of inflation? What are the main types of inflation? What are the consequences of inflation? And who will benefit from the inflation? And who will gain and who will lose from the inflation? These are the major, and how could the government deal with inflation to decrease it? Or how could the government solve this problem? These are the major questions that we have to ask when we study inflation phenomena, right? Okay. Let's go to another term related to the macroeconomics, which is the business cycle. دورة البزنس. The business cycle is the cycle of short-term ups and downs in the economy. It's the cycle of short ups and downs in the economy. So let's draw, or I will go to the figure illustrates the idea of the business cycle. As you see in this figure, this is the business cycle. We have the gross domestic product, or our output. And this is the time. The business cycle is the short run or short term ups and downs of the economy or our output during a period of time. So this period from trough to peak is a short period, and we have ups in the economy or expansion in the economy. From trough up to peak, there is an expansion in the economy, توسع في الاقتصاد, and this period is associated with low unemployment and increasing the overall prices. The expansion period means there is high demand for the products, and we have high demand for the workers. So the employment would increase and unemployment would decline, right? From peak down to the trough, what do you see? It's the opposite case. A recession or contraction, the same meaning, contraction or recession, حالة ركود. During this period, we have high unemployment rate. The prices are low. Yes, the prices are declined during this period. So as you see, let's come back to the definition or the term of the business cycle, which is the short term from this period to period. It's a short term or short time. From this period to these are short-term ups and downs in the economy, right? Is it clear? Okay, let's come back to the concept. The aggregate output. Aggregate output means the total quantity produced in the economy during a given period of time. Aggregate output مجموع كلي للإنتاج تبعنا during a period of time. Recession. I think that you have an idea about the recession. So let's go to the definition of the recession. As you see, the recession is the period during which aggregate output declines. When the aggregate outputs declines for 2 consecutive quarters, it's called a recession or signal a recession. إذا الإنتاج تبعنا نزل في فصلين متتاليين أو في ربعين متتاليين, in this case it would become what? A recession. The deep recession would become what? A depression. So if the recession period sustained for a long time, it would become a depression. Right? So deep recession would become a depression. Right? Okay. Yes, so the prolonged and deep recession becomes a depression. Right? Yes, continue or sustain for a long period of time. Right? Let's go to the unemployment rate. I think all of you have an idea about the concept of the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is or equals unemployment rate equals the number of unemployed over the labor force. The labor force. The labor force includes the people who are unemployed plus employed. So in this case times 100. So the unemployment rate or the labor labor force equals unemployed plus employed. So the unemployment rate equals the number of unemployed over unemployed plus employed, or times 100. So the unemployment rate is the percentage of labor force that is unemployed. نسبة القوى العاملة اللي قاعدين. Right? طبعا the unemployment rate is a key indicator of the economy health. Let's go to the government policies that the government use, or the policies that the government use to stimulate the economy or to solve the different problems in the economy. As I mentioned maybe 20 minutes ago, that the government can use an expansion fiscal policy, sometimes monetary policy, output growth policy, or supply side policy. So let's go to define or to have an idea about the policies that the government can use in order to influence the economy. The government can use 3 major policies or main policies. Number 1, the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means سياسة مالية. Number 2, the monetary policy, سياسة نقدية. And the last one is the growth or supply side policies. When we talk about the fiscal policy, we are talking about 2 main points. Number 1, the government spending or expenditures الإنفاق الحكومي or the taxes, increasing or decreasing taxes, right? So when we talk about the fiscal policy, we are talking about two main points: the government spending or expenditure, and the taxes. We have two policies. Number one is expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy means سياسة مالية توسعية. In this case, the government can increase its spending or decreasing the taxes. So the expansionary fiscal policy is or occurs when the government increase its spending. إذا الحكومة زودت الإنفاق للناس معنى كلمة توسع. Or if it declines the taxes. بطلنا ناخذ taxes من الناس. It's part of the expansionary fiscal policy. Right? We have another thing which is, it's called contractionary fiscal policy. The contraction mean انكماش. The contraction of fiscal policy is or occurs the government decreases spending when there is a declining in spending or increasing the taxes. So if the government decreased or declined its spending on the services, on the employment and something like this, it's called the contraction of fiscal policy. If it increased its collection of the taxes from the taxpayers, in this case, it's called a contractionary fiscal policy, right? So when we talk about the fiscal policy, we are talking about expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy, and we are talking about two main points: the expenditure or spending, the government spending, or the taxes, and it can make both increasing its spending at the same time and decreasing the taxes, right? Which one here? The expansion and contraction. The expansion fiscal policy, the government may use or increase its spending and decreasing the taxes or the collection of taxes. It's called an expansion fiscal policy. And the contraction fiscal policy, or the government decreased its spending and increased the collection of taxes, right? Let's go to the monetary policy. Monetary policy is related to the central bank when it controls the money supply. So here we are talking about the central bank. When we talk about the money supply, as you see, the money or the monetary policy consists of tools used by the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve means the central bank. To what? To control the quantity of money in the economy. So who controls the money supply in the economy? The central bank or the Federal Reserve. So when the Federal Reserve controls the money supply in the economy, if the Federal Reserve increased the money supply, it's called expansionary monetary policy. So here we're talking about the money supply or the Federal Reserve system toward the money or the money supply. So the monetary policy, monetary policy, we are talking about the money creation or the money supply in the economy. And it's related to the policies used by the Federal Reserve or the central bank toward the money, controlling the money supply. And in this case, the central bank or the Federal Reserve can increase the money supply or decrease the money supply by using different tools like the discount rate, the required reserve ratio, and the open market operations. We are going to discuss all these tools deeply, inshallah. But if the government or the Federal Reserve System increase its spend or the money supply, it's called expansionary monetary policy. So the increasing money supply means an expansionary monetary policy. This is, or increasing money supply means expansionary monetary policy. But the reduction in money supply means a contractionary monetary policy. Right? The last policy that, yes.
Monetary policy have a relation with how strong or weak the currency is.
Yes, for sure. If the government, if the money supply increase in the country, this leads to a reduction in the purchasing power of money. Right? But it can stimulate the economy by reducing the unemployment rate, by increasing the employment, as you see. But it leads to increasing the inflation rate. Right? When we talk about the money supply, or the increasing money supply, as I mentioned, leads to what? Leads to increasing inflation rate and decreasing the purchasing power of money. But we are coming to these points in detail with, inshallah, by I think in chapter 6. Yes.
You have just explained the relationship between spending and tax.
Yes.
You said that the government in expanding fiscal policy, increasing spending and decreasing tax.
Yes.
How the government can finance its spending by decreasing the tax? When the relationship between spending and tax is positive relationship, and that's mean when they increase spending, they need to finance this spending by increasing tax.
Okay, but when we come back to your point or your question, you are talking about, we're asking about two main points: the government spending and the government taxes, or the tax collection, right? The problem is, or the government decision depends on what? The economic situation. If we have high unemployment rate, what should the government do in order to solve this problem? It has to increase its spending by on different services, by purchasing different goods and services, by investing in the construction, maybe building new houses, building new projects, or establishing new projects, and spending on the health and medical services, education services, right? So, and at the same time, as we mentioned that we are talking about, we have high unemployment rate. At the same time, when the government use or increase its spending, it has to decrease the taxes or the collection of taxes.
How it can finance spending? How it can gain money to finance
we are talking about the ideal economy. This means that the government has its own sources of fund. So, and it has a sufficient amount of spending of money or something like this. So it has a sufficient or capacity, it has the capacity to spend on the economy and to give the chance for the people to invest and to reduce the taxes.
So we can say that the relationship between spending and tax is positive or negative?
No, negative. No, negative. To solve the problem, suppose that we have, as I mentioned, that we have high unemployment rate, and you are the government, or you are the Minister of Finance. What shall you do to solve this problem? You have to increase the spending and to decrease the collection of taxes. So, they are opposite. Increasing spending, decreasing collection of taxes. Increasing spending and decreasing the taxes. Right? So there is a negative relationship. Right? Is it clear or not? Okay. And the last policy is the growth policies. In this case, the government focuses on stimulating the aggregate supply rather than the aggregate demand. Yes. So, the growth policies are the government policies that focuses on stimulating the aggregate supply rather than the aggregate demand. So in this case, the government, what does the government do? The government in this case stimulates the aggregate supply, the production, rather than the aggregate demand. Yes. بدلا من يعني بدل ما تركز, they focus on what? Increasing supply or the aggregate output instead of the aggregate demand. Right?